actually recording right now, so let's just go for it. Okay.
Go for it.
Okay. Hi everyone, we are in the beautiful city of Izmir in Turkey.
Yeah.
And we are here for a conference. It's called the ICETE conference, discussing formal and non-formal theological education. And so with me, I have Gabriel Benjamin. And I honestly don't know much about him. I just met him because we are in the same small group. And I just wanted to spend a few minutes just talking to him. What is he doing? And on one particular idea as well, I want to talk to him about. So
Sure.
Let's just go to Gabriel. Just Gabriel, if you can just tell us something about who you are.
Oh, great. So just a little bit about myself. I often describe myself as a guy who's from an ethnic background that's Eastern, which is Indian.
Okay.
So philosophically, the Indian mind at work in a South African
When was
with
that?
Western
How
education.
many years ago in India?
Generationally, my family came through the indentured laborer system to South Africa in the 1860s.
Oh wow! Okay.
Yeah. Under British colonial rule.
Yeah.
And so I am currently involved in higher education through the church, Church of the Nazarene.
Where is this?
Church of the Nazarene has a global footprint of, a presence in about 161 countries.
Yeah, but in South Africa, where?
In South Africa, across the length and breadth of South Africa.
Okay.
But I have oversight of, higher educational institutions all over Africa.
Okay.
Yeah. That's universities, seminaries, and colleges. Yeah.
So what would your job title be? Like who
My
are you?
job title would be the Regional Education Coordinator for Higher Education and for Clergy Development.
Okay, that's a long title, but I guess with that comes lots of responsibilities.
Lots of responsibilities, particularly because we are seeing such a phenomenal growth in the church in Africa. And so the idea is to raise clergy to care for God's people.
Okay. So the main reason I want to talk to you about is something that you shared in the small group about how culture corrupts people.
Yeah.
The corruption or deforms people. That's the terminology that you used. And I found that very intriguing. Can you explain this concept and how that applies in your context?
Absolutely. So when we talk about formation, we often think in terms of categories by comparison. So we say, what is formal, what is non-formal? When we say formation or we talk about non-formation, in this case I'm talking about deformation, which means something that was formed, that may have been stripped of its identity, no longer has an identity, and now has to seek new identity. So when we talk about formation, especially spiritual formation, Nigel, the idea would be that we are formed, firstly we're made in the image of God. We talk about the Imago Dei. But there was a time where in Africa, the colonial powers that prevailed would have offered us a preferred identity. So one no longer has the desire to act out their own God-given identity or walk in the image that God has given us through grace. We have somebody imposing a preferred identity, and that's a deformation aspect. Somebody deforms that nature of God in you to the point where we now talk about it as, how do we see ourselves without a colonial identity? Something that is imposed. I come from South Africa, so I'll use an example like apartheid. When we talked about apartheid, what was it that people desired from the South Africans who were identified as non-white? So when we say white, and then we say non-white, again, we talk about formal and non-formal. We then start to measure the non against what is. So we say, oh, this is formal, then this is what non-formal. It draws its identity from what it is not. as opposed to from what it ought to be.
Yeah.
And so when you say, oh, this was white South Africa, this was a non-white South Africa, I'm now asking the question, what am I without the preclips of saying you are non? I cannot be a non-entity. So in Christ, I find formation that says if you're not white, you must be other. And the kind of othering that takes place then makes it a little distant, strange, estranged from the fellowship of God. So I'm not other, I'm not white. What am I?
Yeah. So if I could, I mean, what you're saying sounds very interesting, and yet can you simplify it through an example? I mean, what do
So South Africa has had a history of people who did not understand their own identity, especially non-formed people, non-white people. We claimed our blackness to say we must be black then. And the deformation aspect comes in when we say, who are we in Christ? And without the kind of colonial entrappings and all of the kinds of colonial baggage, do I understand God from the perspective of being South African, from a place of saying, I'm in the image of Christ? If I don't know who that is, it has to do with a lost theology, a theology that did not fully explain my understanding of my identity in Christ.
Yeah, I liked one example that you gave in the discussion about a missionary leader.
Yeah.
So if you could tell us that.
So that's the clarity of it. Who am I? Let's say, for example, we're resourcing pastors and we're saying, go out and win souls for God. And the pastor says, well, I'll take the Jesus film with me. Now, the Jesus film is a wonderful and a noble presentation of the gospel. The problem with that is the image on the screen for Africans is that it's a white man. So a white person now on the screen is the one who's healing in a context where there was no healing. So can you imagine that in Africa, where, you know, getting to a doctor is a very challenging thing. So you find the white man is now seen as the healer, the miracle worker. What do you think that looks like when a missionary shows up? There's the form, that's the image. So there's an expectation. This person is very much like the one that we saw doing all these miracles. So even if the missionary is a black missionary, going out and reaching out to black communities, and let's just say, for example, the missionary has a group of white students from North America. Who do you think that crowd is going to talk to? Because they see the power base as the person that they recognize from the screen. The image of Christ is white. So it's a Eurocentric image of Christ. Again, that's a deformation.
So you mean this, when the missionary goes with his students, the people actually look at the students.
If a black missionary takes white students, and the black missionary is the one who's, for example, the authority in that context, is the leader of that mission, obviously the people that are responding will not respond to that person. They respond rather to the other white students in the.
And so that's what you're calling a deformity. That's not how it should have
it's
been.
Not. It's a misrepresentation of, you know, our being in Christ. We should not be selling the kind of imagery or even the kind of belief and understanding that a certain particular nuanced edition of race is the miracle worker or is the provider or is the protector. There's the deformation.
South Africa has such an intriguing history, especially recent times. How do you feel growth has been made, especially in terms of changing this cultural deformity into positive strides? Has anything happened in your experience where positively culture is changing?
I think the church's role, firstly, in calling out the destruction of the machinery of apartheid, that the church had to be prophetic and say, this is wrong.
Okay.
This is not what God intended. This is not how we ought to be seeing the creation of God. So it starts with the church. We've started to see the reconciliation dynamic at play, but we've not been truthful about what that needs to look like. And so while we are wanting to advance culturally, and the question was, how are we changing culturally?
Culture, yeah.
We still have an endemic racism by and large.
Okay.
And it's not necessarily white on black. It's now black on white, white on black, and there's even xenophobia.
Okay.
So instead of going forward, we tend to be taking a few steps back. What we should be saying is, how does Christ confront culture? How does Christ reform culture? As opposed to what was deformed in our identity.
Yeah. One thing, let me ask you, as an Indian to a South African, do you like cricket?
I love cricket.
So from an Indian point of view, I don't know if it's politically correct for you to say this and whether you have any comment about this, but Bavuma's captaincy, was this a cultural change that the South Africa is trying to do?
Yeah.
Because here's a captain who, according to the world, may not be performing, but he represents something so important for the culture, for the people. And that statement becomes even more important than saying, okay, we need the best performer, we need the best person for the job. How would you, is that one cultural...
Nigel, I think sport is a language.
Okay.
Sport is also a great example of a unifying language. So it's not necessarily Bavuma, it's anyone in a sport leadership role where you've seen captaincies change from performers, to those who have taken on captaincies and may not necessarily be non-performers because of color. That has nothing to do with it. I think the idea of shifting captaincies is an attempt to reform culture. And to say, any one of us can do it. So we mustn't dislocate the idea from the merit of the player, whatever their color is. If a person is a non-performer, let's just say, you need to leave. Let's put somebody in who can actually do the job.
So let me put you on the spot. Do you feel that if Bavuma fails in certain performance things, that he should be removed from captaincy?
I'm saying the point of cricket is to win games.
Okay. Yeah. So,
not to score political points.
Okay. So you are saying that sometimes we have political points being made. And but that's the thing about culture. Shouldn't we make strides to transform the culture like these things?
I think these are domains in which we can make better points within the context of the common languages of the people. And most of South Africa claim to be church attendees. I think that conversation is better held in the church, not even in parliament. These conversations should be from the grassroots. Culture should be transformed by the church, bringing people to understand the value of people of color, of all colors, of all races, all ethnicities. And if you can play the game, it doesn't matter what your color is, play the game.
Okay. Yeah, so even telling is it appropriate to say the black South Africans? The black South Africans, that we should not prioritize between color representation, but
on the basis of merit.
We should go on the basis of merit, and that itself is a cultural change.
Correct.
That we need to develop. And similarly, cultural changes happen at various levels. It's not about like race would be one. Would there be anything else, any other cultural changes that need to be addressed? Like maybe another one, like is it economics or?
That was the one that comes to mind. In the last 30 years, the country has been trying to shift the economic powers. Again, one has to look at what that means in terms of we can't just transfer wealth without transferring the abilities to stay connected with the networks that gave us wealth.
Okay.
And also with the knowledge of how to manage wealth.
Okay.
So wealth creation is one thing, but wealth management is another.
Okay.
And so while we may shift the power of who carries the balance of the wealth, we must also shift the knowledge of how that wealth is managed and distributed so that the economy continues to remain sustainable.
And so, since money is such an important thing, what would you tell a Sunday school child? Let's say simply, with this very point, how would you simplify it for a Sunday school child?
I would say to a Sunday school child that money is important as a servant, and that we must use that servant as God's servant to serve all of God's people.
Okay. Wow. Thanks, Gabriel. I mean, I could keep talking to you, and I probably will, but thank you so much for taking the time.
Nigel, it's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for the
thanks.
invite.
And blessings for you.
Peace and shalom to you. Thank you.